The fall from the sky. The deafening roar of the storm drowned out the luxurious hum of Jackson Hawthorne's private jet. Turbulence rattled the sleek interior, sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor. The cabin lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the distressed faces of the flight crew. The scent of burning metal filled the air. Jackson clenched the armrest of his leather seat, his knuckles white. He had been in control of every aspect of his life. His billion-dollar empire, his meticulously curated world of power and wealth. But now, in the face of nature's fury, he was utterly powerless. A burst of lightning split the sky, and then silence. Then came the impact. A brutal, merciless crash that sent Jackson's world spinning into darkness. A sharp metallic taste filled his mouth as he regained consciousness. The scent of burnt fuel mixed with the dry, suffocating air. Pain radiated through his body, sharp and unrelenting. His leg throbbed violently, and when he tried to move, fire shot up his spine. Jackson groaned, his vision blurred. The wreckage of his jet lay in ruins around him. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the desert landscape. Flames flickered in the wreckage, sending plumes of smoke curling into the night sky. This wasn't how he was supposed to die. A rustling sound broke through the chaos, followed by hurried footsteps crunching against the sand. His fading consciousness barely registered the silhouette of a figure approaching through the darkness. A woman. She knelt beside him, her face partially obscured by the shadows and flickering firelight. "Can you hear me?" Her voice was strong, commanding. "Stay with me." Jackson tried to focus to answer, but his body betrayed him. The cold rain against his skin faded, his eyelids growing heavier by the second. The last thing he saw was the woman's determined expression before the world dissolved into darkness. Jackson stirred, his body sluggish, as if he were wading through a heavy fog. His senses returned one by one. The sharp scent of wood smoke, the soft warmth of firelight, the distant murmur of voices. He forced his eyes open, taking in his unfamiliar surroundings. A rustic wooden ceiling loomed overhead, cracked in places, allowing thin streams of cool air to slip through. The walls were rough-hewn, lined with shelves stacked with jars and old tools. The flickering glow of firelight cast long, twisting shadows along the walls. A woman sat across the room, watching him with wary, sharp blue eyes. She was young, early 30s at most, but her features were lined with the hardness of someone who had known struggle. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy braid, stray strands clinging to her dirt-smudged cheeks. She wore faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt, her sleeves rolled up, revealing calloused hands. Jackson shifted, a sharp pain lancing through his leg. He bit back a curse, but the sound still caught her attention. "Don't try to move," she said flatly. "You might have broken something." His throat was dry as sandpaper. Where am I?" She didn't look impressed by his struggle. "My house. In the middle of nowhere. You're lucky to be alive." Jackson let out a rough breath, his mind still catching up to the events that had brought him here. He studied her, his gaze narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" he rasped. She didn't flinch. "Charlotte Harper. But people call me Lottie." She leaned forward, arms crossed. "I'm the one who dragged your sorry self out of that wreckage. You're welcome." Jackson arched a brow, irritation flickering across his face. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like this, especially not with such blatant disregard for who he was. "You didn't have to," he muttered. Lottie scoffed. "No, I didn't, but I'm not the kind of person who leaves someone to die, even if they—" She gave him a pointed look, sweeping her gaze over his designer suit, now torn and stained with blood. "Ere a city boy who's never had to fend for himself." Her words struck deeper than he liked. He wasn't used to relying on anyone. His world was built on power, control, and calculated decisions, and yet here he was, helpless, dependent on a stranger who didn't seem even the least bit impressed by him. The wind howled outside, rattling the small house as if nature itself was mocking his predicament. Jackson sat in silence, watching her move. She stirred a pot over the fire, the scent of something warm filling the space. Her movements were deliberate, practiced. There was an efficiency to her, an unshakable steadiness. She adjusted blankets, straightened the shelves, even paused to pick up a wooden toy from the floor. Evidence of children in the house. "Why did you bring me here?" Jackson asked, breaking the silence. Lottie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Because you were bleeding out in the middle of a storm. What was I supposed to do? Leave you there? You could have called someone," he pointed out. She snorted. "Called who?" "There's no cell service out here, genius. And even if there were, it would have taken hours for help to reach you. You wouldn't have made it." Jackson didn't reply. He hated feeling indebted, hated the vulnerability of being at someone else's mercy. As the night wore on, he found himself watching her more closely. Lottie wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she trying to impress him. She didn't ask him questions, didn't pry into his life. In her world, he was just another body she had to patch up and keep alive. "You live out here alone?" he asked. Lottie sighed, her irritation evident. "No, my brothers are here. They're asleep in the other room." She hesitated, then added, "And before you ask, no, my parents aren't around anymore." There was something in the way she said it, a finality, a weight that told him not to push further. Jackson stared into the fire, the warmth doing little to ease the cold knot in his chest. He had never felt so small, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him question everything he thought he knew. As the flames danced across the room, exhaustion finally pulled at him. His body gave in, his thoughts spiraling into darkness. The storm outside had passed, but inside him, a new one had just begun. Strangers in the ashes. The first thing Jackson Hawthorne felt when he woke was pain. A dull, searing ache throbbed through his body, centered in his right leg. His muscles screamed in protest as he tried to shift, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. The rough blanket covering him felt like sandpaper against his skin, and the unmistakable scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled the air. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the memories rushed back. The storm, the crash, the woman who had dragged him from the wreckage. His eyelids fluttered open. His vision blurred at first before the dimly lit room came into focus. It wasn't the sterile white hospital suite he was used to. Instead, it was small, cramped, and undeniably rustic. A fire crackled in the hearth, its orange glow casting long shadows across wooden walls. Then he saw her. Charlotte Lottie Harper sat on a stool near the fire, her back partially turned to him as she stirred something in a worn iron pot. Her messy blonde braid trailed down her back, a few stray strands escaping to frame her sharp features. She looked exhausted, her shoulders tense as if she carried the weight of something much larger than just a stranded billionaire. She must have heard his breathing shift because she spoke without turning around. "You're awake." Her tone was flat, neutral. Jackson licked his dry lips, his throat rough as sandpaper, more or less. Lottie grabbed a tin cup from the wooden shelf and poured some water before walking over and handing it to him. "Drink." Jackson took the cup, his fingers brushing hers for a brief second before she pulled away. He lifted it to his lips and drank, the cool liquid easing the dryness in his throat. "How long have I been out?" he asked. 2 days. He choked on the water. 2 days. Lottie leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed over her chest. "You were running a fever the first night. Thought you might not wake up." Jackson exhaled sharply. 2 days lost. 2 days of no contact with his company, no emails, no calls. His private jet was supposed to land in New York for a crucial business meeting, one that could make or break a billion-dollar deal. Now, instead of sitting in a glass-walled office overlooking the skyline, he was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a woman who looked like she had little patience for his existence. His fingers clenched around the cup. Lottie must have noticed his frustration because she rolled her eyes. "If you're gonna start whining about how this ruined your schedule, save it." Jackson narrowed his eyes at her. "You don't even know who I am." "Nope," she said bluntly. "And I don't care." Jackson wasn't used to that. Most people knew his name. They either wanted something from him or feared what he could do. But Lottie, she was staring at him like he was just another wounded animal she had to patch up. His frustration grew. "You didn't ask if I had people looking for me. If anyone would be sending a rescue." Lottie scoffed. "Oh sure, let me just radio the non-existent search party and have them bring their choppers over." She shook her head. "Newsflash, city boy, this isn't the movies. Your fancy world doesn't reach out here. You're in the middle of the desert, and it could take weeks before anyone even realizes you're missing." Weeks. Jackson felt his stomach sink. No, that wasn't possible. He had security teams, assistants, lawyers. Someone would be looking for him by now. Wouldn't they? Lottie must have seen the flicker of uncertainty in his expression because her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something amused. "Welcome to reality," she muttered. Jackson exhaled sharply, forcing his frustration down. Getting angry wouldn't fix anything. "Where are we exactly?" he asked. "About 50 miles from the nearest town," Lottie said. "A small place called Redstone, but you're not making it there on that leg." She nodded toward his injury. Jackson looked down. His pants had been cut away at the thigh, revealing a hastily wrapped bandage over what was likely a serious wound. He glanced back at her. "You did this." "Don't sound so surprised," she said, crossing her arms again. "I've had to patch up worse." Jackson studied her carefully. She wasn't some backwoods recluse. There was a precision to her movements, a confidence in the way she handled herself. She had the kind of presence that told him she'd been through worse than dragging a half-dead man out of a burning wreck. "Who are you, really?" he asked. Lottie sighed. "Already told you. Charlotte Harper. People call me Lottie." And what?" Jackson arched an eyebrow. "No offense, but most people don't just happen to live alone in the middle of nowhere, fixing up strangers." Lottie hesitated for a brief second, then shrugged. "I run a farm. I take care of my brothers. That's it." Jackson frowned. "Just you and your brothers? No parents?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "Not anymore." Something about the way she said it made him realize not to push further. A heavy silence settled between them. The crackling fire was the only sound in the room. Lottie sighed and pushed off the table. "Look, you don't need to understand my life, and I sure as hell don't need to understand yours. You're here because you crashed. I pulled you out. You heal. You leave. That's the deal." Jackson clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to feeling like dead weight. "And what if I don't want to be a burden?" he said. Lottie raised an eyebrow. "You planning on fixing a fence with a broken leg? Herding cattle in a suit? Hate to break it to you, Hawthorne, but you're not exactly useful in your current state." The bluntness of her words stung more than he wanted to admit. Jackson had built his entire life around being in control. He was the one who made things happen, the one people turned to for solutions. Now, he was stranded, broken, and completely at someone else's mercy. For the first time in years, he had no power. It left a bitter taste in his mouth. Lottie must have sensed his frustration because she let out a breath and shook her head. "Look, if you really want to be useful, don't die. That's all I'm asking." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Jackson watched her go, something tightening in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was irritation or intrigue. Maybe both. As the door shut behind her, he was left alone with the quiet crackle of the fire and the weight of his thoughts. He had survived a plane crash. He was stuck in a world he didn't understand. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Hawthorne had no idea what came next. The weight of survival. Jackson Hawthorne had been raised in a world where control was everything. Every deal, every negotiation, Every decision in his life had been carefully calculated, designed for maximum advantage. He had built an empire from nothing, molded himself into a man who wielded power like a weapon. And yet, here he was stripped of that power, stranded in a desert with a woman who barely tolerated his existence. It had been 3 days since the crash. 3 long days of staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the wooden cabin, and counting the slow drag of hours with nothing but the burning ache in his leg for company. 3 days of watching her. Charlotte Lottie Harper was unlike any woman he had ever met. She moved through the house with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. There was no hesitance in her steps, no wasted movement in the way she worked. She carried herself like she belonged to this land, like the harsh desert air ran in her veins. Jackson had spent a lifetime surrounded by polished, strategic people, executives in tailored suits, socialites who spoke in carefully measured words. But Lottie, she was real. She was raw. And she had no patience for his existence. "Eat," she said, dropping a bowl of thick stew in front of him without preamble. The wooden spoon clattered against the edge. Jackson eyed the meal warily. The last time he had eaten anything made by someone other than a private chef had been years ago. He had dined in the most expensive restaurants in the world, had gourmet meals prepared by Michelin-starred chefs flown in from across the globe. And now he was being served something that looked like it had been scooped straight from the earth. Lottie must have caught his hesitation because she arched an eyebrow. "What? Too fancy to eat real food?" Jackson scowled but said nothing. He picked up the spoon, scooped up a bite, and forced himself to eat. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't good, but it wasn't terrible. Lottie watched him for a moment, as if waiting for him to complain. When he didn't, she smirked slightly and turned away, moving to the sink to scrub at an old metal pot. "You don't talk much," Jackson muttered between bites. Lottie snorted. "You talk enough for both of us." Jackson exhaled sharply. "You know, considering the fact that I nearly died, you could show a little more sympathy." She turned to him, leaning against the counter. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto his. "You want sympathy? Poor little billionaire got stranded in the desert and had to eat stew made by a peasant. Cry me a river." Jackson's grip tightened around the spoon. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" she challenged. Jackson hesitated, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had never felt this before. This sense of uselessness, this weight of vulnerability pressing down on him. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered finally. Lottie scoffed. "Oh, please. You think I don't know what it's like to lose control, to feel powerless. I've spent my whole damn life fighting to survive. You crash one fancy jet, and suddenly you think you know struggle." Jackson opened his mouth to snap back, but before he could, the door burst open. A boy, no older than 16, stood in the doorway, his breath heavy with exertion. His face was smudged with dirt, his clothes streaked with dust. "Lottie," he panted. "It's the well. It's running dry." Lottie stiffened, and for the first time since Jackson had met her, her face darkened with something other than irritation. Fear. "Damn it," she muttered, grabbing a worn denim jacket from the hook by the door. "How bad?" The boy, who Jackson assumed was one of her brothers, swallowed hard. "It's real low. If we don't do something soon." Lottie didn't wait for him to finish. She was already halfway out the door. Jackson set down his spoon. "What's going on?" Lottie didn't even glance at him. "Not your problem." And then she was gone. The next few hours were a blur. Jackson forced himself up, ignoring the throbbing protest of his leg, and hobbled toward the doorway. Outside, the desert stretched out in every direction, vast and unyielding. The wind carried a dry heat, making his skin feel like parchment. In the distance, he could see Lottie and her brother working near an old well, their figures moving with urgency. For a moment, Jackson just watched. It was strange. He had spent his entire life surrounded by efficiency, factories, offices, skyscrapers built on the backs of his decisions. But this was real labor. Not numbers on a screen, not contracts signed in climate-controlled boardrooms. This was survival. Without thinking, Jackson pushed himself forward, gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg. Every step was an effort, but he refused to sit back and do nothing. By the time he reached them, Lottie was already waist-deep inside the well, gripping a rusted bucket and struggling to pull up what little water remained. Caleb, the younger brother, glanced up, his gaze narrowing at Jackson. "What are you doing here?" Jackson inhaled sharply. "Trying to help." Caleb scoffed. "Help? You can barely stand." Lottie's voice drifted up from inside the well. "Both of you, shut up and grab the rope." Jackson ignored Caleb's glare and did as she said. His fingers wrapped around the coarse rope, muscles protesting as he helped pull the bucket to the surface. The water level was dangerously low. Lottie climbed out, her face set with frustration. "This won't last another week," she muttered. "We need a better solution." Jackson studied the well, his mind already working through possibilities. "You ever considered irrigation?" Lottie shot him a look. "Yeah, let me just go down to the local Home Depot and buy a fancy irrigation system." Jackson ignored the sarcasm. "I'm serious. There are ways to filter and store water long-term. You don't have to rely on just this well." Lottie wiped the sweat from her forehead. "And who's paying for that exactly? Because last I checked, we don't have $1 billion budget." Jackson exhaled. "I can." "No," she snapped. He frowned. "You don't even know what I was going to say." "You were going to offer money." Her voice was sharp, but there was something underneath it, something almost vulnerable. "And I don't take charity." Jackson studied her carefully. "It's not charity." Lottie shook her head. "To you, maybe not. But to me, it's everything." She stepped closer, her gaze burning into his. "You don't get it, Hawthorne. Out here, we don't just throw money at problems. We fix them ourselves. Because when you start relying on other people's money, you start losing your independence. And I won't do that." Jackson clenched his jaw. "So you'd rather struggle?" Lottie's eyes flashed. "I'd rather survive on my own terms." They stood there, the desert wind whipping between them, neither backing down. Jackson had spent his life breaking people down, bending them to his will. But Lottie Harper, she was unbreakable. And for the first time, he realized. He respected that. He respected her. The night was eerily silent. Jackson sat on the porch, his injured leg stretched out in front of him. Lottie sat a few feet away, staring out at the desert. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Jackson broke the silence. "You don't trust me," he said. Lottie let out a soft laugh. "You don't seem like the trusting type either." Jackson exhaled. "I used to be." Lottie glanced at him. "And what changed?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "The world." Lottie didn't press him for more. And for the first time, Jackson Hawthorne didn't feel the need to explain. The storm within. The desert was an unforgiving place. By day, the sun burned everything it touched, relentless in its heat. By night, the cold crept in like a thief, stealing warmth and leaving behind an emptiness that settled deep in the bones. Jackson Hawthorne had never felt so out of place. It had been nearly a week since the crash. His leg was healing, though every step still sent a dull ache shooting through his body. The pain was a reminder of his fall, of his powerlessness, of the life he had left behind. But something else was changing. He found himself watching her. Lottie Harper moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been carrying the weight of survival for far too long. She didn't waste words, didn't bother with pleasantries, and yet, everything she did, every glance, every carefully chosen response, held meaning. Jackson had spent his life negotiating with men in suits, reading the fine print of every contract, recognizing the smallest flicker of hesitation that could give him the upper hand. But Lottie, she was the first person he had met that he couldn't read. She was a puzzle he wasn't sure he had the pieces to solve. And he wasn't sure why that fascinated him so damn much. "I need your help." Jackson looked up from where he sat near the fire. The night was quiet, save for the distant rustling of wind through dry grass. Lottie stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim glow of lantern light. She never asked for help. Ever. Which meant something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, pushing himself up. Lottie hesitated for the briefest of moments before stepping forward. That was the first sign. Lottie never hesitated. "There's a storm coming," she said simply. "A bad one." Jackson frowned. The night sky was clear, a sprawling canvas of stars stretching overhead. "I don't see." "You don't need to see it," she interrupted. "You feel it." Jackson arched an eyebrow, but she wasn't joking. He could tell by the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides, how her shoulders had tensed just enough to betray the anxiety she was trying to suppress. "Is this a normal thing out here?" he asked. Lottie exhaled. "It's normal to people who know how to handle it." She shot him a pointed look. "Which means not you." Jackson rolled his eyes. "Great. So what do we do?" "We prepare," she said. "Come on." The storm came faster than Jackson expected. By the time they had secured the animals, reinforced the doors, and gathered supplies, the wind had turned sharp and biting. The sky, once clear and full of stars, was now heavy with ominous swirling clouds. Then came the first clap of thunder. The sound ripped through the air like a beast awakening from its slumber. A flash of lightning followed, illuminating the landscape in eerie silver light. Lottie moved quickly, her steps steady as she secured the last of the barn doors. Jackson watched her, impressed despite himself. She wasn't just surviving out here. She was thriving. "How long do these storms last?" he asked, raising his voice over the rising wind. "Could be a few hours," she called back. "Could be all night." Jackson exhaled sharply. "Of course." They turned toward the house just as another boom of thunder rattled the ground. Jackson instinctively flinched, but Lottie didn't. She just kept walking, unfazed by the raw force of nature threatening to tear the world apart. By the time they got inside, the rain had started, not in slow, gradual drops, but in a sudden, violent downpour. Water lashed against the windows, the wind howling like something alive. Jackson sat heavily on the edge of the wooden chair near the fireplace, his muscles aching. Lottie moved around the room with practiced ease, checking the lanterns, securing loose objects, making sure nothing inside the house could be knocked over. He watched her in silence, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw it, the weight she carried. Not just the farm, not just the survival of her brothers, but the constant, crushing burden of knowing that if she failed, if she made even one wrong move, everything would fall apart. Jackson had spent his life making decisions that affected thousands of people. He had signed deals worth billions, crushed companies with the stroke of a pen. He had always thought that his burdens were heavier than most. But Lottie carried hers alone. And that was something he wasn't sure he could ever understand. The hours passed. The storm didn't let up. Jackson sat on the floor, his injured leg stretched out, while Lottie leaned against the wooden kitchen counter. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but it was something. Finally, Jackson broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving?" Lottie turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No." Jackson frowned. "Why not?" Lottie let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping absently against the counter. "Because this is my life," she said simply. "I built it. I keep it running. I keep my brothers safe." She glanced at him. "Why would I leave that behind?" Jackson studied her, his mind turning over her words. "You don't ever wonder what else is out there?" he asked. "Beyond this?" Lottie's lips quirked, but it wasn't a smile. "Do you?" she countered. Jackson opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know the answer. He had spent his whole existence chasing more money, more power, more success. But now, sitting in this tiny house in the middle of nowhere, listening to the storm rage outside, he realized something. He had everything. And yet, he had nothing. Lottie's entire life was built on protecting what she had. His entire life was built on never being satisfied. He didn't know which one of them was more lost. The fire burned low. The wind still howled, but it had softened, just a little. Lottie shifted against the counter, crossing her arms. "You're different than I expected." Jackson arched an eyebrow. "Oh." She nodded. "When I pulled you out of that wreck, I figured you were just another rich asshole who wouldn't last a day out here." Jackson smirked. "And now?" Lottie shrugged. "Still might be an asshole." Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Gee, thanks." Her lips twitched, and for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. Not a sarcastic smirk, not an amused quirk of the lips. A real smile. It was small, barely there, but it was real. And something in Jackson's chest shifted. He didn't know what it was, didn't want to know what it was. All he knew was that for the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The storm within. The storm outside had become a relentless beast, hammering against the house with the fury of an unforgiving world. Wind howled through the cracks, rattling the shutters like the desperate hands of a ghost trying to force its way in. Rain pounded against the tin roof in heavy sheets, a steady drumbeat that matched the racing thoughts in Jackson's mind. And yet, inside the small house, time seemed to slow. Lottie sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that danced across her sharp features. She still had that quiet intensity about her, the kind that told him she was always thinking, always calculating the next step in her fight to survive. Jackson exhaled, stretching his leg out with a wince. He wasn't used to pain like this. He had broken bones before, skiing in the Alps, boxing with a personal trainer. But those injuries had always come with the comfort of luxury. A private doctor, a first-class hospital suite, a steady stream of painkillers. Out here, pain wasn't a thing to be numbed. It was a part of life. Lottie's gaze flicked to his leg. "You'll heal," she said, taking a sip from her mug. Jackson arched an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be comforting." She shrugged. "Depends. You planning on feeling sorry for yourself, or are you going to deal with it?" Jackson let out a dry chuckle. "You really don't pull punches, do you?" Never saw the point. He studied her carefully, the firelight catching in the gold flecks of her blue eyes. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. Everyone in his world played a game. They smiled, they charmed, they lied. Even the people closest to him had always been strategic. Colleagues, business partners, even past lovers. Everything was a move on a chessboard. But Lottie, she was something else entirely. Unpolished, unapologetic, and real. He tapped his fingers against the wooden table, watching her. "How'd you learn all this?" he asked. She frowned. "Learn what?" "How to handle a storm like this. How to survive out here on your own." Lottie let out a slow breath, her gaze flickering to the window, where the rain blurred the view of the desert. "I didn't have a choice," she said simply. Jackson waited. She wasn't the kind of person who gave answers easily. But after a long pause, she spoke again. "My dad taught me most of it," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. "He ran this place before me. Kept it going, even when things got bad." She set her mug down, fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. "Then he got sick, and after he was gone, it was just me." Jackson didn't speak. He knew that kind of loss. Knew what it felt like to have everything ripped away before you were ready. "My mom left before I was old enough to remember her," Lottie continued. So it was always just me, Dad, and my brothers. When he died, well, she gave a humorless laugh. The world doesn't stop turning just because you're hurting. There were still mouths to feed, still land to take care of, still bills to pay. She looked up, her blue eyes sharp as steel. I didn't have time to fall apart. Jackson exhaled. He had always thought his world was ruthless. The corporate battlefield was a place of power struggles, betrayals, and high-stakes deals. But Lottie's world was a different kind of ruthless. It didn't wait for you to be ready. It didn't care if you could handle it. It just kept moving. She had built something out of nothing, held it together with sheer willpower. And she had done it alone. Jackson rested his elbows on the table, fingers laced together. You don't ever wonder what it would be like if things had been different. Lottie frowned. Different how? Different as in, not having to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Lottie scoffed. You mean like you? Jackson gave a small smirk. You don't think I carry weight. I think you carry a lot, she admitted. But I also think you had choices. That hit harder than he expected. Because she was right. He had choices. He had always had choices. His father had built an empire, and Jackson had been raised to take it over. He had spent years proving himself, making sure no one ever doubted that he was the rightful heir to Hawthorne Industries. But if he had walked away, if he had said, I don't want this, nothing would have fallen apart. Lottie never had that option. She had been given one life, one path, and she had no choice but to survive it. Jackson leaned back, letting out a long breath. Maybe I did have choices, he admitted, but that doesn't mean I always made the right ones. Lottie arched an eyebrow. Regrets, Hawthorne. Jackson let out a dry chuckle. More than I can count. For a moment, they just sat there, the storm raging outside, the fire flickering between them. Then Lottie shifted, crossing her arms. You never answered my question. Jackson frowned. What question? She tilted her head slightly, studying him. You ever think about leaving? The life you had before all this? Jackson hesitated. He had spent years chasing power, money, influence. But now, sitting here in a house built by hands, not money, listening to a woman who had fought for every single thing she had, he wondered, would he go back to all of that? To the suits and the skyscrapers and the endless cycle of always wanting more? Finally, he spoke. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now. For the first time in my life. I don't know. Lottie didn't say anything. She just watched him. And in the silence that followed, something between them shifted. Something neither of them were quite ready to name. The storm had finally begun to die down. The howling wind softened into a distant murmur. The rain slowed to a steady drizzle, the harsh edge of it fading. Jackson exhaled, stretching his arms. His body ached, his legs still sore, but there was something different now. He wasn't just waiting to leave anymore. He wasn't counting the days until he could go back to the world he had built. For the first time, he was present. Lottie stood, stretching slightly. It'll be safe to check the damage in the morning. Jackson nodded. Good. She turned toward the hallway, pausing for just a second. You did good today, she said, her voice softer than usual. Jackson blinked. I didn't really do anything. Lottie's lips twitched, just slightly. You didn't complain. That's a start. And then, without another word, she disappeared down the hall. Jackson sat there for a long time after she left, thinking, wondering, feeling. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to go back to the world he had left behind. A different kind of strength. The morning after the storm, the desert smelled different. The rain had settled the dust, washing away the harsh dryness that usually clung to everything. The earth was still damp, the sky overcast with lingering storm clouds, but the world hadn't stopped. It never did. Jackson stood on the porch of Lottie's house, leaning against the wooden railing. His injured leg ached, but the pain was becoming a dull background noise instead of the sharp, all-consuming thing it had been. He was healing. But something else was changing too. For the first time in his life, he woke up without an agenda. No meetings, no calls, no crisis waiting for him in an email inbox. Instead, his first thought had been of her. Lottie. And that wasn't supposed to happen. She stepped outside a few moments later, pulling on her worn leather boots. The wind tossed strands of her blonde hair across her face, and she brushed them aside with an irritated huff. She had a job to do, a farm to run. She barely even looked at him. "Storm didn't do too much damage," she said, adjusting her flannel. "But I need to check the fence line. Caleb's already up at the north end. You feel like getting your hands dirty." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You asking for help?" Lottie shot him a look. "Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm asking if you can do more than sit on that porch and complain about your leg." Jackson smirked. Fair enough. He reached for the crutch Lottie had fashioned for him. Rough, hand-carved wood, far from the sleek medical equipment he was used to. But it worked. It had carried him through the last few days, through chores he never thought he'd be doing, through a world he never thought he'd be a part of. "You sure you trust me with fence work?" he asked as he followed her down the porch steps. Lottie didn't slow her stride. "Not really. But I trust you can hold a hammer." "Debatable," Jackson muttered. She led him to the pasture where the fence had taken some of the worst damage. A few wooden planks had been knocked loose, one section leaning at an awkward angle. Caleb was already working, his face set in concentration as he drove nails into a broken beam. Jackson inhaled sharply, gripping his crutch tighter. This was not his world. And yet, he wanted to be useful. So he grabbed a hammer from the nearby toolbox and got to work. Time passed in a strange way when there were no distractions. Jackson focused on each nail, each board, each movement. The rhythm of physical labor was foreign to him, but strangely satisfying. His arms ached in ways they never had before, his body unused to this kind of effort. But for once, he wasn't thinking about power struggles or balance sheets. Just this. Just the weight of the hammer in his hand. The smell of fresh wood. The way the wind cut through the open land, crisp and real. Lottie worked a few feet away, pausing every so often to wipe sweat from her forehead. She never stopped moving. And for some reason, Jackson found himself watching her, noticing the way her sleeves were rolled up just enough to show the strong curve of her forearms, the way she chewed her bottom lip when she focused. Noticing too much. "Damn it. You're staring," Lottie said without looking up. Jackson cleared his throat, shifting his focus back to the fence. "Just making sure you're doing it right." Lottie smirked. "Cute. You're still slower than Caleb." "Kid's got an unfair advantage," Jackson grumbled. "He doesn't have a busted leg." Caleb snorted but didn't argue. They worked in near silence after that, the only sounds the occasional clang of a hammer, the rustling of wind through dry grass, and the distant calls of cattle from the pasture. For the first time since the crash, Jackson felt like he belonged. Like he wasn't just waiting to leave. Like maybe he didn't want to leave. Later that evening, the three of them sat on the porch, watching the last sliver of sun sink below the horizon. The sky was painted in brilliant hues of orange and violet, fading into deep indigo. It was the kind of view money couldn't buy, the kind of beauty that just existed without needing an audience. Lottie took a slow sip from her water bottle, stretching out her legs. She looked tired but satisfied. "You didn't completely suck today," she admitted. Jackson let out a short laugh. "That's the highest compliment you've ever given me." Lottie smirked but didn't argue. Caleb leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "So, city boy," he said, tilting his head, "you ever gonna tell us what you actually do for a living?" Jackson hesitated, because this moment, felt too real, too simple to taint with the weight of his past. but he couldn't avoid it forever. "I run a company," he said finally. "Hawthorne Industries." Caleb's eyes widened slightly. The Hawthorne Industries. Lottie stiffened. That name sounds familiar. Jackson exhaled. It probably should. He didn't want to say it. Didn't want to see the moment their trust cracked. But Lottie beat him to it. Her eyes darkened, the flicker of recognition setting in. "The land acquisitions," she murmured. Jackson's stomach sank. Yeah. She knew exactly who he was now. Her expression hardened. "Your company tried to buy out the farms in Redstone." Jackson closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't know." Lottie let out a sharp breath. "That's convenient." "It's the truth," he said, his voice steady. "I don't handle every deal personally. I didn't know about this one until—" He gestured vaguely to the landscape. "Until now." Lottie's jaw clenched. "And now what?" Jackson met her gaze. "Now I stop it." A long silence stretched between them. Caleb's expression was unreadable. Lottie's, however, was pure steel. Finally, she exhaled. "And what happens when your company finds out?" she asked quietly. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Then I fight them." Lottie studied him for a long moment. And for the first time since the crash, she looked uncertain. Not because she didn't believe he could do it, but because she didn't believe he would. "You're really willing to burn your own empire for this?" she asked. Jackson exhaled, staring out at the desert. For most of his life, power had been his only goal. But now he was starting to wonder if he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. "I don't know what I'm willing to burn," he admitted. "But I do know this. I'm not leaving until I make this right." Lottie didn't respond. But something shifted between them. A crack in the wall. A hesitation in her armor. And Jackson knew, at that moment, that he wasn't just fighting for her trust. He was fighting for something bigger. Something he wasn't ready to name yet. Something that terrified him more than the storm ever could. The fire that burns. Jackson had never fought for anything in his life. Not really. Sure, he had fought in boardrooms, battled competitors, and crushed rival corporations under the weight of billion-dollar deals. But that wasn't real. That wasn't this. This wasn't about numbers on a screen or winning a game of power. This was about her. This was about Lottie Harper, her brothers, and the land they'd fought to protect. And it was about who he wanted to be. The morning sun stretched long golden fingers over the desert, warming the earth and casting soft light over the small farmhouse. The remnants of last night's storm still lingered in the air. The scent of rain, the damp soil beneath Jackson's boots. He stood near the fence line, one hand gripping the wood, his thoughts a tangled mess. What was he doing? He should have been in New York by now, standing in a glass-walled office overlooking the skyline, dictating orders to assistants who scrambled to do his bidding. Instead, he was here, with her. And for the first time, he didn't want to leave. Footsteps crunched over the dirt behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Lottie. She walked up beside him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn jeans. She didn't speak at first, just let the quiet settle between them, comfortable in the silence the way only she could be. Finally, she said, "You're still here." Jackson let out a dry laugh. Was I supposed to leave? She tilted her head, watching him. People like you don't usually stick around. Jackson turned to face her, his expression serious. Maybe I'm not who you think I am. Lottie studied him for a moment, her sharp blue eyes searching his face like she was trying to figure out if he was lying. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he wasn't. You said you were going to stop the land acquisitions, she said finally. How? Jackson exhaled. I've already sent word to my legal team. The contracts haven't been finalized yet. I can pull the deal. Lottie crossed her arms. And if your company fights back? Jackson's jaw tightened. Then I fight harder. Lottie scoffed. That easy, huh? No, he admitted. It won't be easy at all. Lottie shook her head, letting out a humorless laugh. "I don't get you, Hawthorne. A week ago, you were just some arrogant billionaire who fell out of the sky. And now, suddenly, you're willing to throw your entire empire away to save a farm that isn't even yours." Jackson met her gaze. "It's not just about the farm." Lottie's breath hitched just slightly, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sleeves. She knew. She felt it too. This wasn't just about the land. This was about them. But she wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. So instead, she turned away, running a hand through her tangled blonde hair. "You're insane," she muttered. Jackson smirked. "You're just figuring that out." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. That afternoon, the storm of the night before felt like a distant memory as Jackson followed Lottie out into the fields. Caleb and Noah were already working, mending fences and tending to the cattle. They didn't look at him the same way they had before. There was still caution, still doubt, but there was something else too. Respect. Maybe. Or maybe just the realization that he wasn't just another suit from the city. Noah ran up to him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you really gonna stop your company from taking the land?" Jackson crouched down slightly so he was at the kid's level. "Yeah, kid. I am." Noah tilted his head. "Why?" Jackson hesitated. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I finally understand what it means to fight for something real. Because I care about your sister more than I should." Finally, he just said, "Because I can." Noah grinned, nodding as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he ran back toward the house, leaving Jackson standing there with the weight of his own words. Because I can. He had always had power, had always been able to do things no one else could, but he had never used that power for anything that mattered. Until now. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky burned in brilliant hues of crimson and gold, Jackson found himself sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. Lottie sat next to him, her legs stretched out, her own mug resting on the wooden railing. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The quiet was enough. After a long moment, Lottie finally broke the silence. "What happens after this?" Jackson turned to her. "After what?" She gestured vaguely. "After you fix everything. After your company backs off. After you've done your good deed." Jackson frowned. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Because the truth was, he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to go back to skyscrapers and corporate battles and people who only cared about what he could offer them. He wanted this, the sky wide and endless, the smell of firewood and rain. The way Lottie looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Finally, he said, "I don't know." Lottie scoffed. "That's not an answer." Jackson turned fully toward her, setting his coffee down. "Maybe it is." Lottie looked at him, really looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't want to admit she was holding. Then, quietly, she said, "You don't belong here." Jackson's chest tightened. "And where do I belong?" Lottie opened her mouth, then closed it, because she didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. The space between them was too charged, too heavy with everything unsaid. And then, without thinking, without overanalyzing, without hesitating, Jackson reached out. Just a small movement. A single touch. His fingers brushed over hers, just barely. Lottie froze. Her breath caught. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't pull away. She didn't move at all. And then, slowly, carefully, her fingers curled around his. It was nothing. And it was everything. Jackson swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper when he said, "Tell me to leave, Lottie, and I will." Lottie stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. Then, she didn't tell him to go. She didn't pull away. She just held on to him. And Jackson Hawthorne knew, in that moment, that he had found the one thing he never knew he was looking for. something worth staying for.